We all know about the sheer devastation of World War II. But what if I told you the war wasn't just some political power trip? What if it was actually an economic necessity? You see, the story of how it was all paid for, well, that's one of the biggest, most audacious scams in modern history.
I mean, think about it for a second. It's a real puzzle. In 1933, Germany was completely on its knees. It was a failed state by pretty much every measure you can think of. But then, by 1939, it's invading its neighbors with this massive, terrifying military machine that seems to have just appeared out of nowhere. So how did they do it? The answer wasn't a miracle. It was a gigantic financial con.
Okay, so first we really have to get our heads around just how bad things were. After getting defeated in World War I, Germany got slammed with the Treaty of Versailles. This thing didn't just blame them for the war, it also demanded these insane reparation payments, and that sent the entire German economy into a complete death spiral.
To really feel the desperation, you just have to look at this number. 4.2 times trillion. That's how many German marks it took to equal a single US dollar. This wasn't just a little bit of inflation, this was hyperinflation on a scale that's almost impossible to even imagine. The nation's money was, quite literally, worthless.
And this economic collapse had a truly devastating human cost. I mean, people were using wheelbarrows, full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. You get paid twice a day because the money you earned in the morning would be worth half as much by the evening. Imagine your entire life savings suddenly being gone. Just poof! This wasn't just an economic crisis, it was a total crisis of hope. So into this absolute chaos steps Adolf Hitler. And he wasn't just offering political talking points, he was offering a powerful, almost intoxicating promise to a nation that had lost absolutely everything. He promised a return to greatness.
And look, this wasn't just some political slogan. This was exactly what a desperate, humiliated population was dying to hear. He promised jobs. He promised stability. And most importantly, he promised a powerful new military that would finally erase the shame of that Versailles Treaty. But there was a huge problem. The problem was he couldn't legally do any of the things he promised. The Treaty of Versailles was crystal clear. Germany was forbidden from building the very war machine he was talking about. And on top of that, the country was flat broke. So how in the world do you build a massive army in secret with no money?
And right here, this is the heart of the whole story. The so-called economic miracle that put millions of Germans back to work, it wasn't about building highways or refrigerators. It was all a deceptive, off-the-book scheme designed for one purpose and one purpose only, to secretly fund a new German military.
So, how did they pull it off? Well, Hitler turned to this brilliant, but let's be honest, completely unscrupulous banker named Hjalmar Schacht. His job was simple: find a way to pay for thousands of tanks and planes without a single penny ever appearing on the government's official budget. He had to hide it from everyone.
And this was his absolutely genius invention, the MIFO bill. You can think of it as a kind of fake IOU. The government created a shell company. It had a ridiculously long name, so they just called it MIFO, that existed only on paper. And this fake company was the key to creating what was basically invisible money.
Okay, let's break this down, because it's actually really clever. The government goes to Krupp and says, build us 100 tanks. But instead of paying them with actual cash, they give the factory owner a MEFO bill, which is basically a government-guaranteed promise to pay later. The factory owner then takes this IOU to a private bank and gets real cash for it. And finally, the central bank quietly pays back the private bank. See? It was a roundabout way of just printing money, but it was all disguised as a private business deal.
The scale of this thing was just staggering. In only 4 years, 12 billion Reichsmarks were pumped into the war machine through this secret system. To put that in perspective, that was more than the entire official national debt of Germany at the time. They had created an entire shadow economy dedicated to nothing but war.
But of course, here's the fatal flaw in any scheme that's built on IOUs. Sooner or later, the bill comes due. Every single MIFO bill they issued was a promise to pay real money back in the future. It was a ticking time bomb planted right at the heart of the German economy.
And this timeline just shows you how tight that deadline was. These bills had a 5-year maturity. That meant that by 1939, the Nazi government somehow had to come up with 12 billion Reichsmarks in actual cash to pay off all of these secret loans. And the simple fact was, they didn't have it. Not even close.
This backed Hitler into an absolutely impossible corner. I mean, look at his options.
If they just fire up the printing presses to pay the debt, they trigger the exact same hyperinflation that brought them to power in the first place. But if they default, the entire banking system collapses overnight, and their whole economic miracle is exposed as a total fraud.
So, he chose a third option. At this point, war was no longer just a political ambition. It became an economic necessity. The only way to pay the bills was to go to war and steal the money from somebody else. Even Hallmar Schacht, the guy who invented the Mefo bills, he knew they were heading for a complete disaster. He warned Hitler to stop the crazy military spending, telling him the economy was right at a breaking point. And what was Hitler's response? He fired him, and then he floored the accelerator.
And this is where the Nazi economy really shows its true colors. It basically became a giant Ponzi scheme. And just like any Ponzi scheme, it needs a constant flow of new money coming in to pay off the old debts. For Germany, new money meant one thing: conquering and looting its neighbors.
The timeline of conquest lines up perfectly with their economic desperation. They annexed Austria and immediately seized its entire national gold reserve. Then came Czechoslovakia, where they took its advanced weapons factories and, you guessed it, more gold. Then Poland for its resources and its labor. Each conquest was just a desperate cash grab to finance the next one.
And the looting didn't stop there, not by a long shot. They scanned their own citizens with the Volkswagen program, taking their savings for a people's car that was never actually delivered. They defaulted on all their old international loans. They systematically stripped Jewish citizens of every last bit of their wealth. They even had the nerve to charge conquered nations massive occupation costs, making them pay for the privilege of being invaded.
But here's the thing about an economy that's built entirely on theft. It is completely, utterly unsustainable. You can only keep a scheme like this going for as long as you can keep stealing.
There was no long-term plan here. The only plan was perpetual conquest. That war machine had to keep rolling forward, because if it ever stopped, the entire economic house of cards would come crashing down from the inside. Stopping wasn't an option. And the beginning of the end really came after the disastrous defeat at Stalingrad in 1943. Suddenly, German expansion ground to a halt, and that meant the flow of new resources, the plunder, it just stopped. But the cost of fighting a world war? That was only going up. From that moment on, the economic collapse was just as inevitable as the military one.
So, what we're left with is the staggering question. It really wasn't a case of a stable economy that was later turned towards war. No, the evidence suggests that the economy was the war. The miracle was just mobilization. The debt was the fuel, and the war itself was the final desperate attempt to balance the books through conquest. It was an economic plan that made war not just possible, but completely and totally